Module 3, Records. Purpose: to teach trainees the appropriate method to maintain records in an ALF. Objectives: upon completion of this module, the trainee will be able to demonstrate an understanding of the components of a residence record, demonstrate knowledge of requirement for staff and facility records, including record retention, demonstrate an understanding of the components of a residence record. Residence records must be maintained on the premises and include residence demographic data as follows: name, sex, race, date of birth, place of birth if known, social security number, Medicaid and or Medicare number or name of other health insurance carrier, name, address, and telephone number of next of kin, legal representative, or individual designated by the resident for notification in case of an emergency, and name, address, and telephone number of the resident's healthcare practitioner and case manager, if applicable. A copy of the Resident's Health Assessment Form, ACA Form 1823, or the Healthcare Practitioner's Medical Examination Form. Any orders for medication, nursing services, therapeutic diets do not resuscitate orders or other services to be provided, supervised, or implemented by the facility that require a healthcare provider's order. Documentation of a resident's refusal of a therapeutic diet, if applicable. The resident's care records. A wait record that is initiated on admission. Information may be taken from ACA Form 1823 or the Resident's Health Assessment. Residents receiving assistance with the activities of daily living must have their wait recorded semi-annually. This subsection does not apply to residents who are receiving licensed hospice services when such residents, their representatives, or their physicians request in writing that waits not be taken. For facilities that will have unlicensed staff assisting the resident with the self-administration of medication, a copy of the written informed consent as described before must be deposited in the resident's demographic data. For facilities, a peer organizer assists with self-administration of medication or administer medications for a resident, copies of the required medication records maintained. A copy of the resident's contract with the facility, including any added to the contract. For a facility whose owner, administrator, staff, or representative thereof serves as an attorney in fact for a resident, a copy of the monthly written statement of any transaction made on behalf of the resident. A facility that maintains a separate trust fund to receive funds or other property belonging to or due a resident A copy of the quarterly written statement of funds or the other property dispersed. If the resident is an OSS recipient, a copy of the Department of Children and Families Form Alternate Care Certification for Optional State Supplementation OSS. The absence of this form will not be the basis for administrative action against a facility if the facility can demonstrate that it has made a good faith effort to obtain the required documentation from the Department of Children and Families. Documentation of the appointment of a healthcare surrogate, healthcare proxy, guardian, or the existence of a power of attorney where applicable. For hospice patients, the interdisciplinary care plan and other documentation that the resident is a hospice patient. The residents do not resuscitate order or DH form 18 applicable. For independent living residents who receive meals and occupy beds included within the licensed capacity aren't receiving any personal, limited nursing or extended congregate care services. Record keeping may be limited to a log listing the names of residents participating in this arrangement. Except for residence contracts, which must be retained for 5 years. Ours must be retained for 2 years following the departure of a resident from the facility unless it is a required contract to retain the records for a longer period of time. Upon request, residents must provide with a copy of their records upon departure from the facility. Additional resident records requirements for facilities holding a limited mental health, extended congregate care, or limited nursing services license are provided respectively. Any persons who fraudulently alters, defaces, or falsifies any medical or other record of an assisted living facility or causes or procures any such offense to be committed commits a misdemeanor of the second degree. Is punishable. A conviction and is also grounds for suspension or termination of license privileges. ECC records. A facility providing extended congregate care services must maintain the following. A. Service plans for each resident receiving extended congregate care services. B. The nursing progress notes for each resident receiving nursing services from the facility staff. C. Nursing assessments. And D. The facility's extended congregate care policies and procedures. A facility that is licensed to provide extended congregate care services shall maintain a written progress report on each person who receives such nurses from the facility staff, which describes the type, amount, duration, scope, and outcome of services that are rendered and the general status of the resident's health. A registered nurse or appropriate designee representing the agency shall visit the facility at least twice a year to monitor residents who are receiving extended congregate care services and to determine if the facility is in compliance and relevant rules. One of the visits may be in conjunction with the regular survey. The Monitoring visits may be provided through contractual agreements with appropriate community agencies. A registered nurse shall serve as part of the team that inspects the facility. The agency may waive one of the required yearly monitoring visits for a facility that has A. Held an extended congregate care license for at least 24 months, B. No Class 1 or Class 2 violations, and no uncorrected Class 3 violations, and C. No ombudsman council complaints that resulted in a citation for licensure. A facility with a limited mental health license must maintain an up-to-date admissions and discharge log containing the names and dates of admission and discharge for all mental health residents. The admission and discharge log satisfies this condition provided that all mental health residents are clearly identified. Staff records must contain documentation that designated staff have completed limited mental health training. LMH residents' records must include documentation provided by a mental health care provider within 30 days of the resident's admission to the facility that the resident is a mental health resident and that the resident is receiving Social Security disability or supplemental security income and optional state supplementation as follows. An affirmative statement on the alternate care certification for optional state supplementation OSS form CF-ES 1006 October 2005, which is hereby incorporated by reference and available for review at www.floridarules.org, that the resident is receiving SSI or SSDI due to a mental disorder. Verification provided by the Social Security Administration that the resident is receiving SSI or SSDI for a mental disorder. Such verification may be acquired from the Social Security Administration on obtaining a release from permitting the Social Security Administration to provide such information. A written statement from the resident's case manager or other mental health care provider that the resident is an adult with severe and persistent mental disorder. The case manager or other mental health care provider must consider the following minimum criteria in making that determination. The resident is eligible for, is receiving, or has received mental health services within the last 5 years. The resident has been diagnosed as having a severe or persistent mental disorder. An appropriate placement assessment provided by the resident's mental health care provider within 30 days of admission to the facility that the resident has been assessed and found appropriate for residence in an assisted living facility. Such assessment must be conducted by a psychiatrist, clinical psychologist, clinical social worker, psychiatric nurse, or an individual supervised by one of these professionals. Any of the following documentation that contains the name of the resident and the name, signature, date, and license number, if applicable, of the persons making the assessment meets this requirement. Completed alternate care certification for optional state supplementation OSS form CF-ES form 1006. Discharge statement from a state mental hospital completed no more than 90 days before admission to the assisted living facility, provided it contains a statement that the individual is appropriate to live in an assisted living facility, or other signed statement that the resident has been assessed and found appropriate for residency in an assisted living facility. A mental health resident returning to a facility from treatment in a hospital or crisis stabilization unit will not be considered a new admission and will not require a new assessment. However, a break in a residency that requires the facility to execute a new resident contract or admission agreement will be considered a new admission, and the resident's mental health care provider must provide a new health statement or assessment. A Community Living Support Plan, or CLSP. Each mental health resident and the resident's mental health case manager must, in consultation with the facility administrator, prepare a plan within 30 days of the resident's admission to the facility or within 30 days after receiving appropriate placement assessment. Includes the specific needs of the resident that must be met in order to enable the resident to live in the assisted living facility and the community. Includes the clinical mental health services to be provided by the mental health care provider to help meet the resident's needs and the frequency and duration of such services. Includes and activities to be provided by or arranged for by the mental health care provider or mental health case manager to meet the resident's needs and the frequency and duration of such services and activities. It includes the obligations of the facility to facilitate and assist the residents in attending appointments and arranging transportation to appointments for the services and activities identified in the plan that has been provided and arranged for the resident's mental health care provider or case manager. It includes a description of other services to be provided or arranged by the facility. Includes a list of factors pertinent to the care, safety, and welfare of the mental health resident, and a description of the signs and symptoms particular to the resident that indicate the immediate need for professional mental health services. Is in and signed by the mental health resident, the resident's mental health case manager, and the assisted living facility administrator or manager, and a copy placed in the resident's file. If the resident refuses to sign the plan, the resident's mental health care case manager must add a statement that the resident was asked but refused to sign the plan. It is updated at least annually, or if there is a significant change in the resident's behavioral health. May include the cooperative agreement. If included, the mental health care provider must also sign the plan. Must be available for inspection to those who have legal authority to review the document. Cooperative agreement. The mental health care provider for each mental health resident and the facility administrator or designee must prepare a written statement within 30 days of the resident's admission to the facility or recipient of the resident's appropriate placement assessment, whichever is later, the statement. provides procedures and directions for assessing emergencies and after-hours care for the mental health resident. The provider must furnish the resident and the facility with the provider's 24-hour emergency crisis telephone number. Must be signed by the administrator or a designee and mental health care provider, or by a designated representative of a Medicaid prepaid health plan if the resident is on a plan and the plan provides behavioral health services. May cover all mental health residents of the facility who are clients of the same provider and may be included in the community living support plan. Missing documentation will not be basis for administrative action against a facility if the facility can demonstrate that it has made good faith effort to obtain the required documentation from the appropriate party. A documented request for such missing documentation made by the facility administrator within 72 hours of the resident's admission will be considered a good faith effort. The documented request must include the name, title, and phone number of the person to whom the request was made and must be kept in the resident's file. A record of all residents receiving limited nursing services and the type of services provided must be maintained at the facility. Nursing progress notes must be maintained for each resident who receives limited nursing services from facility staff. A nursing assessment conducted at least monthly must be maintained on each resident who receives a limited nursing service. A facility licensed to provide limited nursing service shall maintain a written progress report on each person who receives such nursing services from the facility staff. The report must describe the type, amount, duration, scope, and outcome of the services that are rendered and the general status of the resident's health. Demonstrate knowledge of requirements for staff and facilities, including record retention. The owner of a facility shall maintain personal records for each staff member, which contain, at a minimum, documentation of background screening, if applicable, documentation of compliance with all training requirements, and a copy of all license or certifications held by each staff who perform services for which licensure or certification is required under this part or rule. Personnel for each staff member must contain, at a minimum, a copy of the employment application with references furnished and documentation verifying freedom from signs or symptoms of communicable disease. In addition, records must contain the following as applicable: documentation of compliance with all staff training and continuing education required. Copies of all licenses or certifications for all staff providing services that require licensing or certification. Documentation of compliance with Level 2 background screening for all staff subject to screening requirements. For facilities with a license capacity of 17 or more residents, a copy of the job description given to each staff member. That will be a question on the test. Documentation, verifying direct care staff and administrative participation in residence elopement drills. The facility is not required to maintain personnel records for staff provided by a licensed staffing agent or a staff employed by an entity contracting to provide direct or indirect services to residents and the facility. However, the facility must maintain a copy of the contract between the facility and the staffing agency or contractor. The facility must maintain the written work schedules and staff timesheets for the most current 6 months as required. And that may be a question on your test as well. The facility must maintain required records in a manner that makes such records readily available at the licensee physical address for review by a legal authorized entity. If records are maintained in electronic format, facility staff must be readily available to access the data and produce the information. For purposes of this section, readily available means the ability to immediately produce documents, records, or other such data, either in electronic or paper format, upon request. The facility's license displayed in a and public place within the facility. That will be a test question as well. Up-to-date admission and discharge log listing the names of all residents and each resident's date of admission, the facility or place from which the resident was admitted, and if applicable, a notation indicating that the resident was admitted with a stage 2 pressure sore, and date of discharge, reason for discharge, and identification of the facility or home address to which the resident was discharged. Readmission of a resident to the facility after discharge requires a new entry in the log. Discharge of a resident is not required if the facility is holding a bed for a resident who is out of the facility but intending to return. If the resident dies while in the care of the facility, the log must indicate the date of death. A log listing the names of all temporary emergency placement and respite care residents if not included on the log described. The facility's emergency management plan with documentation of review and approval by the county emergency management agency that must be readily available by facility staff. The facility's liability insurance policy required. For facilities that have a surety bond, a copy of the surety bond currently in effect as required. The admission package presented to new or residents less the resident's contract. If the facility advertises that it provides special care for persons with Alzheimer's disease or related disorders, a copy of all such facility advertisements as required. A grievance procedure for receiving and responding to residents' complaints and recommendations. All food service records, including menus planned and served, and county health department inspection reports Facilities that contract for food services must include a copy of the contract for food services and the food services contractor's license or certification to operate. All fire safety inspection reports issued by the local authority or the state fire marshal within the last 2 years. All sanitation inspection reports issued by the county health department within the last 2 years. All completed survey, inspection, and complaint investigation reports and notices of sanctions and moratoriums issued by the agency within the last 5 years. That may be a test question. The facility's resident elopement response policies and procedures. The facility's documented resident elopement response drills. The facility's policies and procedures. The facility's medication practices. The facility's policies on physical restraints. The facility's policies on assistive devices. The facility's policies on third-party providers. The facility's policies on visitations. For facilities licensed as limited mental health, extended congregate care, or limited nursing services records.